Welcome to Beyond Belief, Tales of Religious Exodus, where we delve into the personal journeys of people who've left fundamentalist religions. In this series, we explore their experiences within religion, their journey out, and how they found meaning and healing on the other side.
Hey Esther, welcome to Beyond Belief. And you've got quite the interesting story, and I can't wait for you to share it with people. So to start out at the beginning, the broad context, I'm curious if you could share what your background was like, what your religious background was, and where you grew up.
Well, thank you for having me. I grew up mainly in China and a little bit in Canada. So my parents were missionaries in China. My mom was Chinese and my dad's white. And we kind of went back and forth between the two places, but I spent most of my time in China. In China, the church we went to was a very Pentecostal church full of other English speaking people. But in Canada, the church we went to was a conservative Mennonite church. Not quite like horse and buggy, but you could drive cars, but the women still had to wear like head coverings and dresses. So it's quite the contrast between the two places. In China, I was sort of, when I'm at church, it's very Christian. Everybody around is Christian. Most of the other people going there are missionaries. But I had a lot more exposure to kind of the secular world through just daily interactions at school and things like that. But in Canada, it was fully Christian. Like our whole social circle was Christian. All of our friends were, and church and culture were very intertwined that way. Yeah. My parents being missionaries, their focus was actually on the indigenous groups within China. And so we traveled to these really remote villages to go do missionary work. Still couldn't tell you exactly what that was. Trying to convert people somehow, I guess, in whatever way you can. But these were some very interesting places because it's in the mountains. There's like no running water, no indoor plumbing. But yeah, it was fun to go and see. I would just like tag along for the ride while my parents did the work. But yeah, that was a little bit of where I'm from.
Awesome. Did you ever end up doing any missionary work yourself? Like, what does that look like at any point of your experience?
When I was in high school, I joined this youth group in China that was mixed, sort of Chinese youth and youth from other countries. And because I was one of the older ones, I was selected to be the leader. And yeah, I would consider that some missionary work. Like I'd have to lead activities during youth, I would lead discussions and, be the person that knew all the right answers so that all the other people could hear it.
Right.
Um,
Although these people in the youth group were supposedly already committed Christians, right? They were already on board.
well, the foreigners were. Some of the Chinese youth were not.
Okay.
They might have had like a family member, like an aunt or a grandma who was, and then that person would want them to be more in the circle, in the Christian circle, and this is their way of pushing them in.
Okay. So there's this event, it's an experience. I guess this matches a lot. I describe myself as having been raised like evangelical Jewish with similar missionary things. You create innocuous events that have
Right,
their own inherent value, like, hey, the kids are all going to play together. They're going to hang out. It's going to be really nice socially. But then there's undertones that are maybe not so under
right.
that are pushing a specific message. So there's an attraction, and then when you're there, it's added. Um,
Yeah.
it sounds
Mhm.
like so. Was the church sort of like almost like an expat church where
Yeah,
a
it
lot of
was.
international people?
Yeah, because the Chinese government has a lot of control over large gatherings of its own citizens. What we ended up doing was our church of expats had a deal with the local police that if only foreign passport holders attend this gathering, then we could do whatever we want because they can't control expats. But they're like, if Chinese people get involved, then like it might be not safe for them.
So how did the Chinese people actually go to church?
We had house churches, so we would have smaller gatherings in each person's house. And there was also a registered church, registered with the government, so then it's kind of monitored. Yeah, that's very. So the government can say, like, oh, we're not being religiously discriminating. There is a church, but it's very, yeah, they can monitor it and control what's being said and what's being done there.
So you guys were technically a registered church.
Yes, but for expats, not for Chinese people.
Oh, okay. The Chinese people had to be Christian kind of in their own house, small gatherings, but they were still considered part of the community.
Yeah. The registered church would be for Chinese people. Like, Chinese
Okay.
people could attend that one, but
Okay.
Yeah.
And did that happen only a few times a year or something like that? Or was that weekly?
no, they're weekly. Yeah.
Okay. And so were you guys part of that? Like it was a registered church where the Chinese people went?
We went very rarely. It's very liturgical, very like planned. Yeah. Hard to, I don't know. We never went that often.
Right. Right.
Mhm.
Can you explain a bit more what like the main beliefs of like Pentecostal? I have no idea what that means.
So Pentecostal is a little bit more of I call it like a right brain, like emotion feeling denomination in Christianity. So like we'd have very lively music. I was part of the dance team. We would dance during our like worship singing time. It had like flags and all the things. And there's a whole focus on prophecy and seeing visions. So you would pray for miracles and then hope that something would happen. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, that gives me some context. We have in Orthodox Judaism, we've got a bit of that divide. So it gives me some like context of like there's the
Yeah.
left brain intellectuals and the right brain ecstatic-y kind of
Yeah.
bent to it. So the Mennonites and when you come to Canada, it was just a very different. How did your parents end up with such two different denominations based on where they were physically located?
Oh, there's no Mennonite churches in China. So, like, it's already hard enough to convert someone to Christianity. You have to convert them to, like, being a Mennonite is, like, impossible. So they kind of made, like, a exception.
But really, in their own ideation, they were more Mennonite and inherently in how they identified?
My dad certainly was, because that's how he was raised. And being a man in the Mennonite church is a lot easier than being a woman. My mom kind of got sucked into it after she got married. I don't think she knew really everything she was signing up for.
Because of a lot of patriarchy?
Yeah, a lot of patriarchy. Like, the women are supposed to be homemakers, have a lot of children. There's like 0 female pastors in the Mennonite church. Like, the veiling that they wear, which is the denomination that we went to, is like this lace kind of thing that you pin on the top of your head. That symbolized God first, man second, and women last. And women just wore that all the time.
And that was like the women last part of the sentence that's what this covering means. The women
Yeah.
are last.
Huh. Like,
Okay.
they called it the headship order, which sounds something that's supposed to be protective and good, but like, yeah,
Headship as
it's
in who's the head? God is the head. Then
God
the
is
man.
the head, then the man is the head, and then you're not the head.
You're not the head. But you're great. There was their apologetics. It was like, but it's still really good.
Yeah, you're being protected.
Okay, being protected. I like that. It's a good
from
word.
your own thoughts and agency.
So what was your you give a little bit of context for your dad, right? He was, I guess, born Mennonite.
Yeah.
I guess was called to be a missionary specifically. Your mother's journey. What was her Christian journey, especially in China?
She became a Christian in her adulthood. Her family is not Christian. She's the first person. But the person who converted her was someone who was her college roommate. She went to church for a couple of years to try to see what it was all about and didn't believe anything. I think the moment she points to as her conversion is she was really sick and in the hospital and wasn't really sure what the outcome was going to be. That's when she prayed to God and said, "Hey, God, if I live, then I'm going to live my life for you." And she lived, and so she followed through.
Okay, so there was a sort of a spiritual awakening based around almost like a bargaining
Yeah.
for healing, uh,
Mm-hmm.
which is very understandable. So was from what you remember, was your parents' relationship to Christianity very different, one from the other?
I think it ended up being very similar.
Okay.
They both hold Christianity and their beliefs as core and as priority in everything that they did, and tried to, like, they raised us to kind of see the world very black and white. Like, everything is either Christian or non-Christian. And the Christian stuff was good and the non-Christian stuff was bad. And that's the lens they used for everything. Like pop culture, movies, songs, how you dress, like, yeah. So that was one of the very few things that they agreed on.
Right. Okay. One of the few things they agreed on is how religious to be.
Hmm. Yeah.
Fascinating. Okay. And so what was your experience in all of this?
It was kind of confusing for me because of how different each denomination would be, each cultural context would be. And it seemed like I was trying really hard to find how there is one answer that fits for everything. But I was trying very hard. The mental gymnastics were all over the place. I was a very good girl. I knew all the rules. I followed. I did what I was told. I was responsible. I helped out. I knew all the right answers. Yeah, I took on whatever roles that was needed of me and make sure a lot of people told me I had a servant heart, which is just like Christian code for neglecting your own needs.
Yes. Oh, I love that.
Yeah. And another thing that was really confusing for me is missionaries in the church, like in Canada, we had a very, like a higher, we were kind of put on a pedestal. These are very holy people that would dedicate their whole lives to sharing the good news of Jesus. And yeah, like you were seen as someone who's like more holy, very honorable. But then back in China, like our house was such a mess. Like my family's really, like my parents' marriage was a mess. Like there's just a lot of things that were very broken and very, yeah, not working. But I couldn't talk to anybody about that because we were supposed to be these holy good people that had it all figured out.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's an appearance that you constantly have to maintain of like we've got
Right.
our shit completely together, we are the messengers of God. And so any problem needs to be more internalized.
Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah. I resonate a lot with that. When we
And
would
there's a
have
lot of, yeah, a lot of spiritual bypassing too. Like, oh, this is um there's like a glorification of pain and tough experiences. Like the more pain you go through, the more reward you're going to get in the next life.
yeah,
Or like if you're experiencing anxiety or depression or something, you just have to pray it away. That's not holy. So it's a lot of denial of it. And yeah,
right. So pray it away and like power through. And like
right.
it doesn't matter. You don't give weight to the thing itself because it is trivial in the scheme of what is important in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you, on one hand, are confused. On the other hand, obedient, if I can
Yes.
paraphrase. And
Mm-hmm.
and then you're going back and forth between two countries in your childhood. What happens next?
What happens next is my parents they have a high value for education and they wanted us to go to university in Canada. Also because the Chinese high school thing is absolutely bonkers. Like, I did not want to go through that, and I'm really thankful they didn't put me through that. But yeah, have anything about the high school college entrance exam?
In
Do you
China?
know? Yeah, in China.
No, I know in India it's like highly competitive and people like the entire like villages will like send one person to university or things like that. I don't know anything
Yeah.
about China.
It's not quite that competitive, but it's kind of framed as like the score that's going to define your life.
Yeah.
And they study some really tough things. Like people talk about high school being really difficult. You do that test, you get into university, and then it's like so easy,
Hmm.
which is the opposite of what makes sense. Um, so my parents were like, we're not doing that. You're going to go to university in Canada. But to make that transition a little smoother, they also sent us to high school over here. So me and my sister moved here when I was 16 and she was 14. And we lived with some family friends that we had never met up until that point, but they knew of us. And my parents went back to China to continue their mission work.
And it's just the two of you in the family, you and your sister?
Yeah.
And why was it that she was 14 and you were 16? Like, there was no starting point? Like, weren't you, I guess, theoretically 2 years into high school? Or
Yeah, I was 2 years in, 3 years in actually at that point. I think my parents were hoping that I'd only need 1 year in Canada to be able to make that work. Then they discovered that that's not enough Canadian credits. So I ended up doing 2 years of high school, 2 more years of high school, 5 in total. And my sister just tagged along because she wanted to. I'm not leaving my sister. I'm going to go to Canada with her. And my parents were, sure.
wow.
Yeah.
How often were you in touch with your parents when you were living abroad like that?
Like once a week. Like really nearly not enough. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I look back now and I'm like, that is bonkers. How did they think that that was okay? Like,
Right.
just, yeah.
Yeah.
But they're at a very figure it out yourself kind of childhood. So I guess they just, that applies even when they're across the world.
So what was the value system for them, as far as you understand, that allowed them to do that? What was their internal belief system that said we're going to send our daughter to Canada, halfway around the world?
I don't think it was values driving this. I think it was more response. Like they had so much going on themselves, like so much struggle and shit in their own brains and between each other that they didn't have a lot to give to consider what exactly our experience was as children.
So it was a very pragmatic decision that was like completely, if you will, left brain. Like analytically, you can go
Yeah.
to Canada and get good grades and stuff like that. And so the factoring of the emotional experience wasn't present in their decision making.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
I guess I'm drawn a little bit to like a tangent of
Mm-hmm.
you are a therapist yourself, right? Psychotherapist.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious if you wanted to speak briefly around like this pattern almost of like religion means one thing, and then there's the people who are, as you said, extra special, and they go and become missionaries. Is there a personality type that goes along with that from what you've seen?
Like the personality type that would be more likely to become a missionary?
Yes. Yeah. Like, have you met many missionaries over the course of your travels?
Yeah. I think it's a gendered experience, first off, because Christianity is still very patriarchal. Um, for the men, they get all the credit, they get the honor, they can do basically whatever they want, call it mission work, and they get credit and praise and money. And the women who are usually married to guys are stuck. You're not allowed to get divorced, so you have to go with them. And the women are the ones picking up all the pieces behind them, kind of supporting the men. So taking care of the kids, figuring out logistically how to be in a different country, the fucking dishes, like just so it's a very different experience. But yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
It does. It's fascinating context. Could I briefly ask, is divorce not allowed in that specific denomination, in Pentecostal, Mennonite? Where is divorce?
I don't know too much about Pentecostalism in North America, but in the Mennonite community, it's very, very taboo. There's
Okay.
almost no people who are divorced.
And at
Even,
its core, your dad was Mennonite. So
yeah.
guiding it.
Hmm.
Do you notice a pattern of personality type or tendencies amongst the different missionaries that you've encountered over the years?
A lot of them are very narcissistic.
Okay.
Yeah, but yeah, in my dad's case, he was narcissistic and also like he didn't fit well in North American culture. Like it was really hard for him to do all the things that you're supposed to. So in a way, this was an easier way out for him because missionary work can be anything you want it to be. Like you can walk down the street and be praying and you call it prayer walk and then you have blessed your city and then now you get paid. Like that's easier than having to do a 9 to 5.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I'm
Mhm.
constantly drawing parallels from your very overt missionary background to the basically missionary parents that I had. Uh,
Mhm.
but speaking more about that, is the fitting in bit, would you say maybe a neurodivergence?
Yeah. I think he was neurodivergent. He also had other mental health disorders in there.
Okay. What's your relationship with him now?
It's it's a very strained relationship for a long time, but right now I am trying to make peace with it and trying to distance myself.
Okay.
Um yeah, like try to make peace with the fact that he's never going to be the dad that I want, and that's okay. He doesn't have to do that. That he's on his own journey. He's got a lot of his shit that he's not willing to look at or work on, so that doesn't need to be my problem anymore.
Right.
Mhm.
So the taking responsibility for thing that could be very natural for someone with a, what's it called? Uh,
Servant heart.
servant heart. Exactly.
Yeah.
Uh,
Oh, yeah.
yeah. So back, I would love to expand briefly. How is it that they all have narcissistic personalities, or often there's a tendency towards that, more
Yep.
accurate, yet their supposedly entire life is devoted towards othership, right? Towards others. How do we balance those two? What's your perspective on that?
I think it has a lot to do with the high status that's given to missionaries in the church. Like, because especially with overseas missions, you can spin the story however you like and nobody else can refute it,
Yeah.
right? They
No one
don't
sees you.
know the context. Huh?
No one sees you to see
Yeah,
what
no
you're
one
doing on a
sees
day to
you.
day. Yeah.
Yeah. You can tell them you're doing all these amazing things and no one can say, "No, you didn't do that," because you're the only one that was there. And that praise and that credit is really boosting to the narcissistic ego. I am this great person. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think
Makes a lot of
narcissistic people have a very good way of, like, in Christianity, it's very easy there's a formula for how to be good and how to be considered good. And yeah, you do this and people like you, or you do this and people think that you are extra holy. So that formula is very easy to manipulate.
Right. Right. And the narcissist likes the clearly defined method. It's like a very easy world to walk. Yeah, it's an easy kind of path to walk. Whereas normally in society there might be more discernment of a wider
Mhm,
range of factors. Here,
mhm.
if you do X, Y, and Z, and maybe it literally is three things or something about that,
Yeah.
you can everything else will be disregarded of how you
Mhm,
are, and that will be maintained. Regular society has some, can be diverted from bigger issues, but in religious society, you're taught to have that really narrow focus. So
mhm,
that's the only lens that people will look at you.
mhm. Yeah.
Okay, so you're going through high school, you're far away from your parents, and what does the journey continue into? What happens next?
I I started dating somebody from my Mennonite youth group, and I think I'm gonna marry this guy because that's what you're told, and
What does
that
dating
doesn't.
look like when you're Mennonite?
You have to be there's a lot of thinking that happens before the first date. So you have to be very certain that you want to be with this person before you even go on a first date with them. And at that point, I didn't think enough about what I wanted, and like it wasn't really about whether or not I liked people. It's more like if he likes me, then like that's the one. I got to jump on that train. I got to make this happen. I got to get married. And yeah,
Do you feel like that was a Christian value or more of a personal self-esteem thing?
I think a little bit of both. Especially in the Mennonite culture, getting married young is very common. Like people in our church got married at 19, 20. And combined with the way that I was raised to not put my needs first and not even put any mental energy towards finding what those are, what I want and what I like, makes it really easy to just jump on whoever comes first.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. So how did you dodge that bullet? That could have been a disaster.
He broke up with me, thank goodness. He was also a missionary kid, but his parents weren't missionaries for as long as mine were. But yeah, he came to the point that he thought I deserved better,
That
which I
sounds like
find
code word
really
for
upsetting.
something else. What was the code word? Do you know? What do you think it was going on for him?
I don't know. We had a lot of, like, the relationship itself, objectively speaking, was not healthy. Like, we could not communicate very vulnerably about anything. I'm like definitely more anxiously attached, so I'm here like, talk to me. I want to tell you what's going on in my day, and then he's there like, I have just like not very in touch, very avoidant, very not in touch with his feelings, and like didn't give me much. And I'm here like, we also lived a 40-minute drive away from each other, which made it kind of difficult. So a lot of communication was over text or things like that, and did not work very well to
Yeah.
build a solid relationship. Yeah.
Okay. So how did you end up at the point where you're at where how would you describe yourself now, religious wise?
I would say I'm spiritual, but not religious.
How did that come about?
we I'll fast forward through this little part, but wait, I ended up going to university for social work, and during one of my practicums, I met my now husband, Stone, at a community soup kitchen. And I met him in Christmas Eve of 2019. It's very cute. Yeah.
So we're just
He
coming up
was,
on 5 years now.
yeah.
And so you were still pretty young.
I was still pretty young. I was 22. Yeah, 22. Yeah. But we shared sort of similar values. Like at that point, I was kind of on the spectrum of Christianity where I was thinking like Jesus would actually be in the soup kitchen with us if he was walking the earth today. And he would, yeah, not be super pragmatic about the rules. He would really care more about social justice issues, things like that. So when I met Stone, that was kind of where we clicked, is on that. And then he was going to a very universalist seminary, so kind of deconstructing Christianity, deconstructing the Bible's inerrancy, which is the belief that everything in the Bible is 100% true. And so, yeah, then the pandemic hit, and we just had so much time to talk because, the bubbles and you can't go anywhere. So we had a lot of time to chat and really wrestle with those questions on a deeper level. At the same time, my sister came out to me as a lesbian and told me she'd been dating a girl for a year at that point, which was so shocking to me because I'm quite close with my sister. And I'm like, how can you not tell me you were dating somebody for a whole year? And I knew at that time we were taught that, being gay is a sin, but I cared about her so much I did not want to lose this relationship. And so now I had to reckon with, how do I love this person? How do I stay in relationship with someone that I care about while they're quote unquote sinning? So then I started digging into why is this a sin? Who got to define it was a sin? And then once you start unraveling, a lot of definitions of sin were just ways of controlling people, then it makes it really hard to be convinced that that's the right way. And also, at the same time, a lot of things happened in 2020. At the same time, the American Trump elections were happening. And I was just shocked at how many Christians s- follow Trump with like blindfolds on. I'm like, are we reading the same Bible? What is happening here? Like, this guy is not Christian. And so then I really wanted to distance myself from that label too, because I'm like, I don't want to be that. This is not my values, and I don't want to be seen in the world as somebody who's in that camp. So yeah, it was kind of a very slow but steady transition away through the pandemic. And because I didn't have to be physically in church, that also made it easier. I didn't have to have this like weekly check-in. Then after things opened up, I'm like, I don't know if I even want to go back to church. What's the point? Yeah.
You get a nice little break. I actually had somebody on the podcast just the last episode, and he made a similar point. He was like, get away, take a month off, and just stop being exposed to the constant drip of pressure. You can't think straight when you're inside it. Right? So give
Yeah.
yourself some time. So it sounds like you got a little bit of that almost circumstantially in some way. So I was going to ask, was there one? So it sounds like there was a bit of a slow process. I guess you've spoken to this, right? There wasn't any one. It was like a accumulation of things. Your sister coming out, the political inclinations and values of the Christians around you, exploring sin. Was there anything else that was kind of like a final straw for you, or was there a specific point in time where it was like all gradual process?
It was very gradual and all of a sudden. So very gradually, I'm like having these conversations. I'm sort of moving away from the drip. And when I got an opportunity to go back to a church, Stone and I actually tried to go to a very liberal Christian church who like talked about social justice issues. Like, they were what I wanted before the pandemic. And I left that church and I bawled my eyes out. And I don't even exactly know why, but I think part of it is me wishing I had more of that being my Christian experience. And the other part of it being, I still don't resonate with this. I still can't see myself going to this church, even with all of their social justice values. And I think that's the moment I knew.
Right. You had tried it all. You had gone to the leftmost side of the spectrum of where you were at, and it's like it's still not working for me.
Mm-hmm.
Was there any law in particular growing up that really messed you over? Any commandment or?
I don't know. This is not explicitly written in the Bible, but it was very, very clearly taught, is you're not allowed to have sex until you get married. And it seems like a fairly straightforward rule, except that the implications bleed into every area of life. Like, it taught me to be really disconnected from my body. I can't trust what my body's feeling. There's like very little sex ed about the spectrum of sex. It's just like, this is how a baby's made, and you do not want that. It taught me to be kind of afraid of men, because there's the thought that, oh, they can't control themselves and you have to be very careful around them. And yeah, I felt feeling very objectified from a very, very young age. Like, I think the first time I really felt objectified was like 13. Like, it started really young. Yeah, and the idea that your whole value is wrapped up in this one thing. Like, if I can stay pure and non-sexual in every way, then like I'm set. But reality doesn't work like that. So like, I like made out with my high school boyfriend, for example, and after that I felt super guilty and super like, oh shit, I did something wrong, I need to ask for forgiveness. And that didn't help our relationship, obviously. I also didn't realize I was bi until after I deconstructed all of the purity culture shit. Because before that, I was like, of course, we need to be so careful around women. They are beautiful.
Meanwhile, not everybody might have been grappling with that same challenge.
No. I was like, yeah, I could definitely see how a guy would be very tempted.
That's great. Great.
Yeah.
So I'm tempted to go in like a few different directions here. One is, yeah, if I can, if you feel comfortable elaborating on when you felt objectified when you were 13. I'm curious what
Hmm.
that was, and part of me feels like it may have been seemingly innocuous and yet like more sinister beneath the surface.
Yeah. Like, I remember showing up to youth group one day in like at I don't know, in like 2011. Like it was really popular to have the shirt that fell off your shoulders on the one side. So your one shoulder was covered, the other one was like exposed. And I showed up to youth group in that, and I got called aside to be like, there's guys here, you should cover that up. And I'm like, "Oh, okay. Okay."
So you're
And
getting
then
called out on your physical appearance, and
yeah,
it's being tied right into the guys around there in that moment.
yeah. And then immediately into like there's variations of this metaphor, but the one I remember is like, do you want to be like the pile of on sale shirts at Walmart where everybody flips through, or do you want to be like the gorgeous expensive dress that's behind a glass?
Right. The
Yeah.
sort of having been used, the rag that's been, yeah, yeah,
Mhm.
all of that, the implication that it stays with you, that it's just it colors your soul forever, all that.
Yeah, and you're
Yeah,
not as valuable, right? Like you
yeah,
just
exactly.
someone can take you and leave you, and it's too
Your
easy.
your sale price drops. Yeah.
Mhm.
It's still tied into the retail
Yeah.
experience. So you finally, eventually decide that you're out. What was like one of the what was that like to be on the other side?
It it's unsettling at first because you don't have all the right answers anymore, and you actually have to think for yourself. And it's also hard because now like the belonging in that community is conditional upon you sharing the same beliefs. And so it's really hard to keep those relationships. Like, yeah.
So you lose both the intellectual structure of where you are in the world and the community that you have.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. So what has helped you?
Um, so I my husband is also a therapist, and the two of us together have built a very healthy relationship, and that has really helped me be able to trust myself and love myself and see my own value. And there's a lot of deep rooted shame that comes in growing up religious. Like just from the idea like I'm a sinner and I need God to save me before I can do anything right. So nothing about me is good unless it's God. So having to now that I don't have God, I'm like, "Oh shit, am I just terrible?" Of course not. But it's a lot to unpack, and it helps a lot to, like, have that person to reflect back to you to say, like, "Yes, like, you are valuable. I like doing life with you. I like hanging out with you. I like to hear what you have to say." Yeah, that was helpful, and then I started therapy. Been in therapy for, like, 4 years now. That has also been super helpful because reckoning with, like, the religious stuff and also the parental trauma. Yeah. And I also found that hearing other people's stories of deconstruction really helpful. Spent a lot of time on social media during the pandemic and found a lot of like other people who talk about their deconstruction journey. And I love how relatable it is. Like I've never met this person in real life, but the experiences that they've had and are now deconstructing or are making a joke about. I'm like, "Oh my goodness, that happened to me." I could and feeling seen and feeling like, "Okay, I'm not the only one going through this," was very helpful, especially when you're leaving your community, right? That you want to know that there's something on the other side. You're not just gonna be off on the deep end by yourself. Yeah, those are things that were the most helpful.
Amazing.
Mhm.
Curious about your therapy. Did you find a specific modality or specific therapist was particularly helpful for you?
Yeah. I've only done 2. I actually tried a Christian therapist first, and then after that, I was not getting better, and I was like, "Fuck this." I went to see a ACT therapist, so acceptance commitment therapy, which is a lot about cultivating self-compassion, which is a really good antidote to shame. And I also saw a Gestalt therapist who kind of worked a lot more somatically, so like feeling into the feelings in my body and listening to those and giving space to that. Yeah, those have been super helpful.
Yeah, I appreciate that, like, more detailed glimpse. People talk a lot about, oh, therapy, but like, what is it?
Mhm.
What form? There's so many forms of therapy that people might or may not realize when they're looking for a therapist. Uh,
Mhm.
I
Yeah.
like what you said about compassion as an antidote to shame.
Mhm.
It's a bit. I think I've experienced that myself, but it's a very worthy reminder.
Mhm. Yeah.
What do you find fosters compassion?
Suspending judgment. So I catch myself a lot still having judgmental thoughts, but now I know I have a choice. I don't have to identify with these judgments. They don't have to define my identity and they don't have to define my world, my reality.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. If you need to attend to the baby, that's
I
fine.
My mom is with the baby. Should be okay.
Okay, good. Yeah. Okay. So I'm trying to think what else. So there's a couple of things that you were specifically interested in talking about as well. So the comparison of different cultural contexts and religious denominations. I guess it's almost like like a positive aspect of the entire arc when you look back on it.
Yeah. Huh. Yeah. I found it kind of interesting to see how Christianity was practiced in various cultural contexts, which gave me a really early, my parents did not intend this, an early open mind to like be interested in what people's experiences are before, instead of assuming what their experiences are. Yeah, because I could see such a spectrum of way of living in the city, in the country, in extreme poverty, and also when I came back to Canada, sometimes it was kind of a shock at what people considered normal. I was like, this is luxury. You have a hot tub in your backyard? What? Or just really basic, even more basic than that. Like, you get to go back to school shopping and buy all brand new stuff. That's a luxury. But that just kind of made me more like have a softer spot for human experience and that everybody's on their own journey. And I could really draw on that when I started leaving religion that, okay, there's other ways of living that aren't Christian. It's not the Christian way, and that's okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's funny. I resonated with that. Not quite with. I don't think it gave me open mindedness. I remained a judgmental asshole for many years, but exposure as and the value of exposure per se.
Right.
Because of my missionary parents, I had a similar aspect of exposure that far exceeded any of the local religious people that I grew up with. They were all in their
Mhm.
bubble, whether that would be in China or in Canada and your equivalent. And then I
Mhm.
am traversing worlds. Like every week, people are landing in my lap from a completely different culture, and I'm encouraged to interact with them with an agenda. But I end up picking
Mhm.
up on things. Osmosis, I end up becoming
Mhm.
more worldly. I still knew that I was right and they were wrong, obviously, but there was still an aspect, ironically, an upside to that wouldn't have been there had my parents remained like that, blinders on, one foot in front of the other type of religious that was my classmates, for example. Um,
Mhm.
did you
Yeah.
mentioned also about that the hypocrisy of growing up in religious communities? What was some of the hypocrisy that you noticed?
I just like the thing that stands out to be the most is how hypocritical my own parents were. They still do this. They still ascribe, they say with their words, Christianity is the best way. Marriage between a man and a woman is the best thing. If you're a Christian, then your life is good. These are things that they say repeatedly in various words. But their own life proves the opposite of that. Like, they have an absolute shit marriage. And it's a man and a woman. Like, they said that's the only criteria, right? And things are not all peachy when you're Christian. Like, you actually have to do therapy and you have to do emotional work, and you can't just spiritually bypass everything. Like, that's not good mental health practice. Yeah, so like those two things just really stand out at me, and like how they are dedicating their whole lives to these messages that they are saying, and yet their own lives contradict that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you just summed up my main experience of leaving. I never thought of it from a hypocrisy lens. I thought of it as a falling short or being sold. It is hypocritical, right?
Mhm.
I always thought of it as like being sold and not being delivered, essentially.
Mm.
But yes, that entire thing. Do you find, this is again building on that, do you find that missionaries in particular, and I think you alluded to that when you mentioned Pentecostal, do missionaries tend to have to emphasize the life enhancing aspects of religion more than somebody who is just, a Mennonite in like rural Canada kind of thing?
Oh yeah, because another thing that my parents talked about was like you don't go around explicitly saying the gospel story everywhere you go, but you're supposed to, like, your life is supposed to reflect God, right? So everything is salt and light. It's supposed to be everywhere. And people see the way you live and they're going to be like, "Oh, what's different about your life?" And then they ask you about it,
Yeah. You're
right?
such an
That's
amazing role model to the
yeah.
Christian way of living that it
Yeah.
inspires people to join you.
Yes. Which is very ironic because yeah,
What
they're
is,
like,
why is I always loved Christian vocabulary, blows my mind. They live in a parallel universe to like the English language. What the hell
mhm.
is special about salt?
Oh, there's a Bible verse about be the salt and light in the world.
Because salt
Something
is
like
like flavoring and it makes things
yeah.
taste good.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Okay,
Because
like if
salt
I had
is
to think of like
everywhere.
two best things, I would be like fluffy puppies and like I don't know, chocolate. I wouldn't think
Yeah.
salt, light. Light, I hear there's like an obsession with light, but salt is like has to be the right amount. Too much salt, Esther.
Oh,
That's
yeah,
I
too
think
much
the
salt
lesson
is
we've
not good.
learned here. Uh,
Very salty people in the church.
salty people. Ah. Oh, yeah, I think. Look, I think you and I should start a religion, and it should be called the Church of Saltiness. Everyone's like the
I'm
Church of
down for
Light.
that.
The Church of
Yeah.
Light is like a dime a dozen, but there's not
Yeah.
nearly enough Church of Saltiness, and there should be a lot
Yeah.
of snacks.
Right. I'd appreciate that.
Yeah, a lot of snacks. That only salty snacks. Yeah, I'm curious. If you have any, you've already given some really good suggestions of things that helped you. Is there any other words
Yeah.
of advice or suggestions you would make to somebody else in the same journey?
Well, first I want to just speak to how scary it can be to leave. Like, religion is designed so well that all of its edges are very coated in fear. If you leave, something terrible is going to happen to you. And because they have the whole afterlife narrative, you can't disprove them with hard fact. You can't be like, no, there's no hell, there's no heaven. I'm going to be fine the next life. So there's always like a little bit of ambiguity, like, and fear to suck you back in. But I just want to say that that's the only thing it is. The fear is a tactic to keep you in. It's so much better on the other side. So much more freeing, and you can live so much more authentically and more healthy than you would if you stay in. And if you start questioning things and they don't line up, the answers don't make sense anymore. It's because the answers don't make sense.
I love that. That's the reason.
It's the
Complicated.
reason.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Amazing.
You shouldn't need to be doing mental gymnastics every day of your life to make sense of the world.
I think that's stated very well. I'm curious. The final question I usually like to invite people. So if you have any questions for me.
Hmm. What would you say to your very religious self? If your young religious self could see you, What do you think their reaction would be, and what would you say to them?
Oof, that's a good one. I'm just throwing myself arbitrarily into that stage of life where it feels most salient, and I think it's like early teens.
Hmm.
And there's a real
Hmm.
obsession with early teens with like right and wrong, and you start encountering the bigger world in a way
Hmm.
where it starts to be like more scary, and so you start to entrench more deeply into your beliefs because this is the time where you start to understand yourself in the world, and if this is your world, now you have to understand your world more deeply. And for me, there was a real battle around uh, trying to understand the world that didn't make sense. Its own internal logic was flawed, but I
Hmm.
knew of the 100% certainty that it was right. And so now I'm leaning against a very splintery crutch, essentially, is how the metaphor that jumps to my mind. I think
Hmm.
ultimately I wouldn't have been able to handle it. I think the way people who'd left religion were painted at the time, I think they've eased up a little bit on this, but it was like, you're just a miserable, drug addicted youth. Like the misery of it all was emphasized. It was like, look at those
Hmm.
punks sitting on the park bench. You're happy, you've got meaning, and they're just sitting there lost and being raucous and like eating sunflower seeds. That's like the pastime of
Hmm.
Israelis and leisure. And look how unhappy they are, which is true. They were unhappy,
Hmm.
but that was
Hmm.
probably why they left. And also the lack of community was probably perpetuating it. Like it's a vicious cycle. But I don't want to be
Hmm.
that. I don't want to be
Hmm.
that, right? And so a lot of the things that I have achieved now in my life, um, I don't think were values back then to
Hmm.
myself. My first inclination was to say things like, money, and relationships and stuff like that. But I was even add like even emotional mental health, which I now
Hmm.
have much more of. I've been like, what's the point of that? Like I remember being like, why be a nice person? Like not overtly, but like the values were very clear, and the values was, can you accumulate enough like Bible knowledge as possible? Essentially, everything else was
Hmm.
secondary. Like it wasn't really clear to me why you should be a good person as a means to an end, yes, but like somebody with like self-regulation, kind, like being, I was not a kind child,
Hmm.
and I don't really understand the kindness as an inherent value, as something that comes from within. It was like you have to act kind, right? It was all sort of imposed. So there was a real conflict between my internal shittiness, a friend of mine calls it internally fucked system, and the outside world of like, oh well, you just got to be nice, and a lot of people around me were practicing that same kind of religion. So it would have been it would be a real challenge, and so I think there would be almost no room for dialogue is my concern
Hmm.
back then because of how extreme. But if I had to package it up in some way anyways, you may as well have like, final parting words. I think I would probably just say it gets better, right? This
Hmm.
miserable life that you're living right now, I want to promise you that it gets better and the journey is not easy.
Hmm.
But if that is helpful to you, that's what I'll leave you with. Like you are not happy right now, and your issues with unhappiness that make you unhappy are very valid. Like this is not
Hmm.
your problem. This is not a problem with you. This is not a you problem, right? This is a them
Hmm.
problem. I think I summarized it once in the past as the like, when you look around your classroom and you see 25 other kids and you say, surely I'm the crazy one here and not all of them. No, the answer is really you are the only one thinking straight in an entire room full of children, right? And your teacher,
Hmm.
right? And that
Hmm.
that feeling that you have of like something's not matching up, that is correct. This is very similar to what you said before. That not something not matching up is actually valid. You don't have to gaslight yourself for the next
Hmm.
10 years that you actually are wrong and they're right, which is the only way to prop it all up. That you're missing something, there's something here right beneath the
Hmm.
surface that you haven't encountered that they all know. It's not true. They're just, for whatever reason, which is actually really hard to understand, they're fine with things as they are.
Hmm.
And this speaks a
Hmm.
little bit, it's a bit of a tangent, but it speaks a little bit to the pattern that I've noticed in these interviews. And, the people who leave are oftentimes the most devout. Like they
Yeah.
really fucking took it seriously. And that spectrum of like, I can only do things well forces you eventually a lot of times to get up and leave. Because if you're the
Hmm.
kind of person who's got this bandwidth of like, yeah, whatever, it's all right, and you can look around, there's a lot of religious people like that, they stick around because there's nothing
Hmm.
pushing them one way or the other. They've got room for movement internally. They've got a better shock absorption system. And no matter what
Hmm.
bump they jump over, they kind of like rebound back into that place where they were. And so it's the actual opposite stereotype of oh yeah, people who leave religion, they just want to fuck around, and
Right.
they never take it seriously. It's actually the inverse from everything that I've seen from most people.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. Like, I was the one who knew all the right answers and did all the things, and
Yeah,
did not work. Yeah.
exactly. And you devoted
Mhm.
a lot of your energy, right? I think Bible study groups and
Yeah.
roles, and there was a real commitment. What
Mhm.
people don't realize, and this is one of the biggest indictments of the religion, is that the people who are most committed oftentimes end up leaving, right? This is not
Mhm.
about how hard they tried. They tried so hard
Mhm.
that they're gone. And what does that mean? What does that say about your religion that those people like that are gone?
Mhm.
Especially if they're not
Yeah.
narcissists,
Mhm.
which I think was a great point. Anything else?
Oh, thank you for having me. This was
Amazing. Esther,
delightful.
thank you so much. I appreciate your psychological perspective as well. So it's particularly refreshing.
Mhm.
Thanks for joining us today.
Good.
Awesome.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Beyond Belief. If you found the episode inspiring, please share it with others who might benefit from it, and be sure to subscribe to get updates about future episodes.